Welcome to Hub Dialogues. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at the Hub. I'm honored to be joined by David Frum for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series, Frum Dialogues. David, as listeners and viewers know, is a staff writer at The Atlantic, the author of several books, and a highly coveted guest and commentator on various cable television programs. We're honored to provide him with a platform to share his insights and analysis on key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's episode, we're discussing economic developments in Canada and the United States, including the prospects of a recession, and what the consequences may be for our politics and public policy going forward. David, thanks as always for joining us.
Oh, so good to be with you.
I suppose I should start with the question that everyone in Washington is talking about. Is the U.S. economy in a recession? And either way, does it matter?
If it is a recession, so far it's a very mild one. Milder even than 1990-91, which is a very mild one in the United States. The early economic figures suggest that the economy contracted in the past 2 quarters, which meets the kind of rule of thumb, not a technical definition, but a rule of thumb definition. But employment remains high, price pressures remain strong, and everything, and except for certain commodities, supplies are in short supply, not in loose supply. There is a joke, one commodity, copper, the price has collapsed so much, there's now a joke that thieves are now dropping off copper at construction sites rather than taking it away. But it certainly doesn't feel, if it is, as I say, if it's a recession, it's so far a very mild one, and it may not be one. It may just be an artifact of the way the statistics are collected. If you want a job in the United States, it's pretty easy to get one.
We'll come back to the subject of commodities, particularly with respect to the state of Canada's economy later in the conversation. But I want to stay on the U.S. for a minute. You've been more bullish on the Biden administration's record than a lot of others, including even those who've been critical of former President Trump. What's the case for President Biden's economic policy agenda? What are its critics getting wrong?
Well, he has critics on the left and critics on the right. The critics on the right get wrong is that the inflation and supply problems we have are part of a global economy, and someday the global nature of the world economy is something that Americans especially have difficulty understanding. And I remember I grew up on books about the Great Depression that talked about it as if the Great Depression was something that happened to the United States with the rest of the world, off in the chorus somewhere, not understanding this was a global crisis. It did start in the United States, but it was because of the interaction of the American and German economy, not because of something that happened in the United States alone. Today, we have, if you don't understand the role of Chinese COVID crackdowns and the weakening of global supply chains and all the economic problems we've had since the end of COVID, the end of the acute phase of COVID, you're missing the point. This is a global. These are global price pressures, and there's very little the Biden administration can do about them. And when they try, they do stupid things. They blame meat packers for the price of meat going up. They suggest, remember when the gasoline prices were going up, they said, "Oh, this is because the refiners are so greedy." Well, now gasoline prices have been declining at the steepest rate ever recorded. Did the petroleum industry suddenly reform like Ebenezer Scrooge in the last pages of Christmas Carol and decide, okay, that's it. We now love humanity. We're going to be less greedy. Or is this commodity of all the one that is most set in a global, interlocked, highly efficient, highly transparent marketplace? But what the critics on the left get wrong is Biden passed a lot of major spending bills at the beginning of his administration. There was a huge COVID relief bill already passed under President Trump. Then Biden did his own COVID relief bill. Then he did a big infrastructure bill. All of this at a time of supply constraint. The Biden people were trying to apply the lessons they thought they'd learned from 2009 when they believed President Obama hadn't done enough stimulus. This time they did. The Obama stimulus of 2009 was about $800 billion, which seemed an enormous figure. But we've now had $1 trillion of fiscal stimulus under Trump, another fiscal stimulus from the Biden COVID relief, another $1 trillion over a number of years from the infrastructure bill. And he wanted to do a Build Back Better bill, which was basically all the social welfare ideas the Democrats had, for another $1 trillion on top of that. So Joe Manchin saved him from himself. I'm not sure that President Biden totally objected to that in his innermost heart. We do have now a supply and inflation problem, but the defense of him is he's gotten a lot passed, and the recovery from COVID which was his job one, has been strong. I mean, people are back at work, and although COVID is never going to disappear, we're learning to manage it and live with it in ways that are not draconian, don't involve shutdowns, unlike China.
One of the arguments for Biden is that at some level, the challenges facing the U.S. economy transcend a single administration. We've had a long run, really even before the global financial crisis, of easy money and deficit financing, all with the goal of trying to buck up overall demand in the economy. In hindsight, it now seems clear that insufficient attention was paid to the supply side of the economy. With that in mind, David, do you think we're going to see something of a rebalancing of economic policymaking with a greater focus on the supply side going forward?
Yeah. I think we're going to talk and think a lot more about the supply side, but the policy challenge is pretty difficult because here's what, to my mind, what the supply challenge is about. We are used to thinking about supply in terms of shortages of investment capital, shortages of, and that's something you can adjust with levers, with taxes. The big supply constraint we're going to have all over the developed world is people. The baby boom arrived in labor markets in the 1970s, reached its peak of productivity in the 1980s and 1990s, would have begun to retire about 2010, but delayed their exit from the workforce because of the shock of the world financial crisis. So thank you, baby boomers. We got an extra 4 or 5 years of effort from them. But the eldest baby boomers are now in their 70s. I guess I was born in 1960, so I'm technically a baby boomer. I'm on the back slope. I just turned 62. And so we're going to, over the next 5 or 8 years, we're going to see the baby boomers leave the workforce entirely and much smaller cohorts. Now, what is the supply response to that? And some people say, well, it's immigration, but the problem is the immigration in the developed countries comes into the labor force at the bottom, and you're losing people, you're losing your most skilled and literate and numerate workers. And anyway, the countries that are immigration centers also face demographic problems. There was a baby boom through the whole world, and birth rates have been declining through the whole world. So the answer to the impending tightness of human labor is going to be technological substitution. But that is something that policy can help. Policy. I mean, one of the questions for policy is how safe do self-driving vehicles have to be before they're allowed on the streets? And obviously, we want them very safe, but do they have to be very, very safe, or will we acknowledge the shortage of labor by saying very safe is safe enough? And that problem is going to ramify through the whole economy. But that's the thing I think we all need to start thinking about: is the impending human labor shortage and the impending challenge of substituting technology for people.
Well said, David. Just in parentheses for listeners and viewers, the Canadian-born workforce has been shrinking for several years in Canada. Were it not for our high levels of immigration, we would actually have a declining workforce. So as you say, that represents the most significant supply challenge facing our economy, not just today, but for the foreseeable future. I asked about possible long-term consequences with respect to these different economic developments. Let me pick up at that point specifically with respect to monetary policy. In the aftermath of the high inflation, high interest rate era of the early 1980s, monetarism that reflected inherent conservatism about central banks trying to micromanage the economy was really central to monetary policy in Canada, the US, and elsewhere. That's since been overtaken by a more activist monetary policy that's been prepared to experiment with zero interest rates, quantitative easing, and all the rest. Do you think that one of the consequences of this experience is that monetarism is going to be back in the ascendancy? And if so, what are the economic and policy consequences?
Well, there's sort of barstool monetarism, and then there's technical monetarism. And I think barstool monetarism is back, but technical monetarism will not be back. So barstool monetarism says you create a lot of money, and you're going to have then prices are going to go up, obviously, and that didn't happen. We seem to get from the year 2000 and the 9/11 crisis through the global financial crisis through COVID. That old barstool wisdom didn't seem to apply. Boy, has that ever applied over the past 2 years. So barstool monetarism, a lot of money, prices go up. That's right. Technical monetarism always bumped into the question: well, what do you mean by money? What is money? And there are a lot of arguments about which monetary indicator to watch. And the problem, and the reason that technical monetarism broke down after its success in the early 70s, was it turned out that whatever measure you pick, this is a problem that will be familiar to students of physics, whichever measure you pick to watch and monitor stopped working. So you always are having to choose because when the behavior of an observed particle, your observance changes the behavior of the particle you're observing. And so when you watched M2 stopped working. So you shift, or I think the original plan was watch M1, which is the narrowest definition of money. Then it shifted to M2, and now there are ever more, M3 with a little, 1 and 2 above it, and technical monitor, and with modern technology and all these synthetic and off the books forms of banking, actually knowing which money supply to watch, that's a really challenging problem. And the other thing that is wrong with that kind of monetarism is we in the 1970s we all adopted the mantra of Milton Friedman that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. And that, the oil price shocks of the 70s, the rise in commodities, those were responses to monetary promiscuity. And I think that was right about the 1970s. But it's pretty inescapable that in today's world, we have a real supply problem. That all you'll do by tightening money is allow the supply problem to force us into recession. You will not curb. In fact, this may be a case where the tool invented to solve the problem of stagflation in the 70s may cause stagflation in the 2020s because we have authentic supply problems that monetary policy can't fix.
You mentioned earlier progressive critiques of President Biden. I want to pick up that point. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party has found itself in a position of some influence in the past several years. I think, for instance, of the profile and energy behind figures like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Yeah. Is there reason to think that the return of inflation and possibly a renewed sense of some budgetary constraints may actually diminish these progressive voices and in turn enable President Biden and other Democrats like him to pull the party closer to the Clintonian center?
Well, I'm not sure how much policy influence any of these people had. That I think they're, Ocasio-Cortez especially, Nancy Pelosi has made very clear her low opinion. She said, it was of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that she said a glass of water could get elected in your district if it had the Democratic Party nomination. They have other agendas. They are raising money on social media. It's their job to be noisy, but they are trading the noise for the real way you have influence as a backbencher in the House of Representatives, which is sitting on a committee, rising to be chair, doing the Blinken work. Not going on TV all the time, and certainly not being on Instagram all the time. But they seem more powerful than they are because of the president's age and other factors. He's much less visible a president. So these people who are not really important but who are noisy, they seem more important than they are. The other thing that the progressives do is they then encourage the Democratic base to have crazy, unrealistic expectations about what you can accomplish with 50 Senate seats. I was in the Bush administration when Bush had 50 Senate seats, and Dick Cheney had to break the tiebreakers. Bush passed two big bills in his first, two big civilian bills aside from 9/11, and he thought that was great with 50 seats. The tax cut and the education bill. 50 seats, that was amazing. And then he flamed out. He didn't get his trade and promotion authority that he wanted. He didn't get any of the other major domestic things he wanted. Biden's passed major bill after major bill with 50 seats. Those are big wins. And I think Biden could say to the progressives, if you want me to do more for you, that's on you. Send me more senators. And anyway, this discussion is about to end because I think the Democrats will be in a weaker position after November than they are now. But Biden, from a point of view of racking up the wins for his party, Biden's racked up much more wins I would say Biden has won more legislative victories with fewer votes than any president of the modern era.
Let me ask you the flip side of that question. Is there a world in which Democratic vulnerability on bread and butter economic issues for conservatives incentivizes Republicans to get back to a more conventional center-right economic agenda?
Yeah, I think there's a hint. We were speaking just after a series of primary votes. I think there's a hint in the Tuesday results that the opposite may be the case. That what has happened is what people like me, what I have been saying is that I thought that abortion would be an important issue in 2024, but it was going to be a little abstract in 2022, which would be an election about inflation. Well, you look at the results from this Kansas abortion rights referendum and the massive turnout, and my theory looks like people are responding to theoretical risks. So it may be that actually the Republican advantage on bread and butter issues may be about to be canceled out by Republican extremism on social issues. I mean, when you have prominent Republicans welcoming 10-year-olds giving birth as the least bad outcome to the sexual abuse of a child, it turns out people really respond to that. And that, just to put this in one more context, Kansas is a state that Donald Trump won by 14.5 points in 2020. And a record turnout in a primary contest just defeated an attempt to change the Kansas Constitution to end the protection of abortion rights in the state of Kansas. Donald Trump won Texas by only 5 points. And Texas has this time a pro-life referendum on it, but a very provocative one. If millions of people in Texas come out to vote that down, that may tip the Texas governorship, which is a very close race from Republican to Democrat. So I had been skeptical that abortion could be a powerful issue for the Democrats this year, but I may be wrong. It may be a much more powerful issue than I had thought till now.
Let's bring the conversation to Canada as we wrap up. I was on television recently, David, and the host asked me about what the Canadian government ought to be doing to deal with inflation and the potential for recession. My answer was there are inherent limits on the government's ability to engineer a so-called soft landing because so much of our near-term economic prospects depend on what happens in the United States. Let me ask you a two-part question. First, do you agree with that assessment? And secondly, what would your advice be to Canadian policymakers in a world in which they probably have less agency over these matters than Canadians might appreciate?
Well, my intuition is that Canadian voters are quite sophisticated about the limits of Canadian policy. And that they don't ask themselves, are we doing well or are we doing badly? Because they understand that's not up to the politicians. They ask, are we doing better than the Americans or worse than the Americans? So in the period from 2008 to 2012, Canadians noticed that the Canadian economy performed much better during the Great Recession than the American economy did. Now that was partly good luck. That was partly because of past decisions. Canadian banks were not allowed to do the kind of crazy securitization that American banks are allowed to do, and so the Canadian banking system got buffeted, but it survived intact. It became rapidly returned to profitability. Canadian business lending continued, and so Canada had, of all the major economies, the fastest return to pre-crisis levels of employment and output. Only Germany and Australia did nearly as well, but Canada did better than either, depending on how you measure it. So Canadians said thank you to their government. Stephen Harper got reelected, but also every provincial government, just about every provincial government that came up for reelection between 2009 and 2013, whether left, right, center, they all got reelected. Canadians got it. In 2001, the dot-com bust. Again, Canada got hit less hard than the United States had done because Canadians had invested less of their wealth in the stock market. And so when the stock market collapsed, there was less of a wealth effect on middle-class savers. So again, Canadians and governments, again, like the Jean Chrétien government, tended to get reelected in 2000, 2001. But back in 1990-91, the United States had a mild recession, which became a very serious recession in Canada. I think the worst since World War II. And this recession, so you have to go back 30 years to find a recession where Canada suffered more. If this recession, if that's what we're having, and if what's going on here is that governments are tightening monetary policy and fiscal policy too, and driving down commodity prices, Canada probably will suffer more from that than the United States. And then we'll see whether Canadians who got it in 2010 about the limits of their government will continue to get it in 2022 and 23. One more thing, one other point is Canada's vulnerable not only on commodities, but because Canadians have put so much of their wealth into housing. And it does look like we are about to have a global contraction in house prices. And Canada is way out on the limb there. And so a lot of people who think they have an $800,000 house might discover they have a $700,000 house. And they may have made plans that depend on that being an $800,000 house. And then they'll be caught in a very familiar problem with politicians. Everybody hates inflation, but every homeowner wants the price of their particular house to be. They want cheap prices at the store, high price for their house. And as those things get ironed out, you can get some great middle class discontent as people lose thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of dollars on the value of their home.
Just an aside on your point, David, about the power of a sense of relative performance in the context of the global financial crisis. I've always thought there's a kind of fascinating story to be told about how those sentiments combined with the hosting of the Vancouver Olympics in 2010 and the country's strong performance there created this political context in which people felt good about the country and about their own circumstances, and that manifested itself, as you say, not just in the federal election, but elections across several provinces. Let me wrap up with
just one more point on that. Canada in the 2010s was again the only major developed country not to have an extremist populist political movement of any strength. But as the truck convoy showed us, that is not in the nature of things. That was just in the contingencies of things. And if Canada does suffer more in the 2020s, that kind of movement could arise in Canada too.
Point well taken. Let me wrap up with a question about the possible political economy implications of some of these big economic developments. We'll have a federal election in 2025, all things being equal. The Trudeau government will have been in power for basically a decade at that point, and it would be challenging to win re-election in normal circumstances. But if we've come through a pandemic and then a period of inflation and then a possible recession, what opportunities does that represent for an incoming conservative leader? And what should he or she be doing to seize on a weak economy as a core part of their prosecution of the Trudeau government in the lead up to the next election?
Well, the advice I always give to opposition leaders in parliamentary countries is try to say as little as possible, because you're always under pressure to be doing things because the partisans of the opposition party believe that opposition parties win. But in parliamentary democracies, and especially in Canada, opposition parties don't win, governments lose. And you never quite know until the last minute exactly why the government loses. And so the job of an intelligent opposition leader is to be ready, to have the party well organized, to have good candidates, to have money in the till, but not to commit yourself to an election proposition. Let the government lose on its own and preserve your freedom of action to be ready to govern in your turn, and don't be so hasty. And and that's easy to say. It's hard to do, but it's really important. And I fear very much that the Canadian Conservatives have committed themselves to a series of courses of action. And maybe there's time to unwind it, but I just think they've been too talkative, and that the slogan for any opposition party is time for a change. And change from what? Change from this. Change to what? Change to that. But we'll tell you, we have to respond to circumstances. And if you, for example, invested on we are the party that knows how to stop inflation, what if in 2025 Canada is emerging from a serious deflationary episode? That may not be the right message. So keep your powder dry, be prepared, have good candidates, raise money, and understand that the government will lose, you won't.
Well, there's great advice there. In effect, a lot can change between now and 2025, and the different parties vying for power will have to account for some of those various contingencies. David, thank you as always for joining us for our bi-weekly conversation. I look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.